At 4:17 on an August morning in Haskell County, Kansas, the north pivot was still moving. SFX, distant electric irrigation motor, slow metal creak. Not because the Reyes family wanted to water corn in the dark, because by then the corn was making demands the land could not afford. Pause, the pipe crawled in a perfect circle. The sprinkler heads hissed into hot black air. The electric meter on the pole spun like it was trying to escape the box. And beneath the field, far below the sand and silt and caliche, the aquifer gave up another invisible amount of itself. Not much, a sliver, a fraction. Pause. But that was the part nobody wanted to think about, because in western Kansas, one fraction at a time was how a county disappeared. Let me tell you about the Reyes farm, because this is not a story about a miracle crop. It is not a story about one young woman being smarter than everybody else. It is a story about what happens when an entire place builds its confidence on water that does not come back. Pause and then laughs at the first person who keeps the receipts. The Reyes family worked 1,620 acres east of Sublet. Their ground had been in the family since 1958, when Rafael Reyes came north from Durango with two brothers, a borrowed pickup, and an understanding that land did not have to love you for you to love it back. By the time Rafael's son Daniel took over, the farm had become respectable in the way farms are respectable in that part of the country. Winter wheat, irrigated corn, a little Milo when a banker wanted to see diversification written on a form. Good equipment, not new equipment. No unnecessary debt. No fancy speeches, just enough caution to survive. Daniel Reyes was the kind of farmer who could hear a bad bearing before anyone else could see it. He knew the difference between a field that was thirsty and a field that was already hurt. He knew which quarter had clay streaks, which one blew first in March, and which pivot always walked crooked after a hard rain. He was not careless. He was not ignorant. He was, by every local measure that mattered, a good farmer. Pause, and that was exactly why he was hard to change. His oldest daughter, Lena, came home in May of 2011 with a soil science degree from Kansas State, a used laptop, and a spiral notebook that was already half full. She had spent 4 years learning the words for things her father had always felt with his hands: water holding capacity, root architecture, evapotranspiration, recharge rate, net return per acre. She had also learned something that made coming home difficult. The Reyes farm was not failing because her father did not know how to farm. It was succeeding on a system that was quietly running out of time. Pause. The Ogallala Aquifer sits beneath the high plains, like an old savings account that every generation promised it was only borrowing from. In parts of western Kansas, rain comes in 12 to 18 inches a year when the year is generous. Recharge can be measured in fractions of inches over long stretches of time, but a center pivot can pull in feet, and for decades that mismatch had been treated like a future problem. By 2011, on the Reyes farm, it was no longer future. It was in the pump logs. It was in the power bills. It was in the way Daniel stood by a well and listened a little longer than he used to before walking away. Lena saw it first on paper. One evening in June, she put her notebook on the kitchen table after supper. Her mother, Teresa, was rinsing plates at the sink. Daniel was sitting with a coffee cup he had not touched in 10 minutes. Lena opened to a page with 4 columns. Corn, grain, sorghum, irrigation hours. Net return. Pause. Daniel looked at the page, then at his daughter. He knew what was coming before she said it. She told him she wanted to take corn off the north quarter. 96 acres. The sandiest ground they farmed, the field that punished them every August. She wanted to plant drought, tolerant grain sorghum there instead. Not the old emergency Milo people planted when they had already lost a year. Newer grain sorghum lines. Deeper roots. Lower water demand. Better heat response. Less seed cost. Less electricity. A crop that did not need the pivot to run like a hospital ventilator all summer. Daniel did not interrupt her. He let her go through the spreadsheet. He asked about markets. She had called 2 elevators and 1 feedlot buyer. He asked about harvest. She had combined settings printed from extension bulletins. He asked about herbicide. She had a plan. He asked about insurance. She had already spoken to the agent. Then he asked the question that had nothing to do with agronomy. Pause. What are people going to say when they see sorghum under that pivot? Lena looked down at her notebook. Then she looked back at him. They'll say you let your college girl waste good corn ground. Daniel's face did not change, because that was exactly what he had been thinking. Teresa turned off the water at the sink, she said. Then make sure the numbers are better than the talking. That was all she said. Daniel stared at the page for a long time. Finally, he said, 90, 6 acres, 1 season. No more than that. Lena nodded. Pause. 1 season was enough to start a fight with the whole county. By the first week of July, the field had emerged dark and even. By the second week, people knew. Not because Lena announced it, not because Daniel talked about it, because in a farming county, a crop is a public statement whether you mean it to be or not. Boyd owned Harlan Seed and Supply on the west edge of town. He was 63, broad, shouldered, loud in a way that passed for leadership, and old enough that people mistook his confidence for wisdom. Every morning from 6:30 to 8 o'clock, farmers gathered at his counter for coffee, parts, weather complaints, and the kind of advice that was never requested, but always delivered. Boyd heard about the Reyes sorghum field from a chemical salesman. The next morning, while 3 farmers waited on a hydraulic hose, he said Daniel Reyes had apparently let his daughter plant sorghum on pivot ground. There was a pause. Then the room laughed, not viciously. That almost would have been easier to answer. It was the softer laugh of men who believed the world had already proven them right. Boyd shook his head and said, "That girl's about to learn the difference between a classroom and a county." Pause. Then he added the line people repeated for months. "You don't save a farm by planting feed grain where corn belongs." Lena heard it 2 days later from her cousin, who heard it from a mechanic, who heard it from a man who claimed he had been standing right there. She did not drive into town to argue. She did not correct Boyd. She did not defend herself at the elevator. She went to the north quarter just after sunrise, stepped between the rows, and wrote down 3 numbers: soil moisture, pivot hours, plant height. Pause. That was her answer. 3 numbers in blue ink. Every other morning she took more. Leaf roll at midday, night recovery, irrigation depth, wind speed, canopy color, pump start, pump stop time. Not one of those numbers was dramatic. Nobody clapped for them. Nobody gossiped about them over coffee, but every number was a small act of disobedience against the easiest sentence in the county. We've always done it this way. Then 2012 arrived like a verdict. By May, the wind was wrong. By June, the wheat looked tired before harvest. By July, the air over Haskell County felt metallic, as if the sun had turned the whole sky into machinery. The drought that year did not behave like weather. It behaved like pressure. Day after day above 100 degrees. Southwest wind that pulled moisture from open soil and green leaves alike. Cornfields that looked fine in the morning and wounded by evening. Pivots that never seemed to shut off. Electric bills that landed on kitchen tables with numbers nobody wanted to say out loud. Across the high plains, farmers did what farmers do when the season turns against them. They worked harder. They timed water more carefully. They checked nozzles. They checked wells. They stood at the edge of fields and tried to decide whether the crop was still responding or whether they were just spending money on grief. Daniel's corn on his better ground survived. But survival is not the same as winning. It pollinated unevenly. Ears tipped back. Yields fell. The corn price was strong that year, but strong prices do not erase weak bushels and high input costs. That field made 91 bushels per acre, not 191. Not some unbelievable number that belongs in a legend, 91, but it did it on the poorest irrigated ground the Reyes family had, and it did it while using 44% fewer irrigation hours than corn would have required on that same field. The fall price for sorghum ran below corn, as everyone had warned Lena it would. Boyd had not been wrong about the discount. He had been wrong about the math. Lower seed, lower fertilizer, lower pumping, lower stress at pollination. The net return on Lena's sorghum came to $204 per acre, more than double the corn. The crop Boyd Harlan had called feed grain on good ground, made twice the money with half the thirst. Daniel sat at the kitchen table in October with Lena's notebook open in front of him. Teresa was leaning against the counter with her arms folded. Nobody said anything for nearly a minute. Daniel turned one page, then another. He looked at the pump hours. He looked at the per-acre return. He looked at the handwritten note Lena had made on July 19th, when the temperature had reached 106 degrees. Leaf roll severe at 2:10 p.m. full recovery. By 8:35 p.m. heat. Then he said, "How much ground would you change next year?" Lena did not answer immediately, because she understood the size of what he had just asked. Not, "Were you lucky?" Not, "Can you prove it again?" Not, "What will people think?" He had asked her to make a decision inside the farm, she said. "Not all of it. Corn still belongs on the best ground in the right, but the bad water ground should stop pretending it's corn ground." Daniel nodded once. Pause, then write the rotation. That sentence was shorter than an apology and larger than permission. In 2013, Lena moved 360 acres into sorghum, all on fields that had historically required the hardest irrigation to make average corn. She added a small cover crop trial behind wheat on 140 acres, cereal rye, radish, vetch. Not because it would pay that year, because bare soil was another kind of leak, and she was tired of watching the farm lose what it could not easily replace. The year was not as brutal as 2012. That mattered. Corn performed better on the Reyes farm's best ground. Corn beat sorghum, just as Lena said it would. But on the weak water fields, the sorghum kept winning the quieter contest. Not yield, margin, not pride, survivability. By fall, the laughter had changed shape. People still did not call Lena right. That would have required too much rearranging, but they stopped calling her foolish. At the elevator, questions began arriving sideways. What basis did Reyes get on that Milo? Did she have trouble at harvest? Is she contracting it or selling spot? Was the lower pumping real, or is Daniel just babying her numbers? No one wanted to admit the question underneath all the other questions. Pause. What if the girl had seen the problem before the men at the counter did? Boyd Harlan did what men like Boyd often do when certainty becomes expensive. He stopped joking. He did not apologize. He did not endorse the change. He simply found reasons to be in the back room whenever someone mentioned the Reyes fee. Silence, from him, was not humility, but it was evidence. Pause. In February of 2014, the county extension office asked Lena to present her data at a winter crop meeting. She almost said no, not because she was afraid of speaking, because she knew what the room would look like. Older men in seed caps, bankers standing along the wall, a few younger farmers with their arms crossed, wanting to be convinced, but not wanting to be seen wanting it. And somewhere in that room, probably in the back, Boyd Harlan pretending he had only come for the coffee, Daniel told her. Then, without telling her, he went too. Lena stood at the front in a brown work jacket with a thumb drive in her hand and her notebook on the table beside the projector. She did not begin with a story. She began with water. She showed the well logs. She showed pumping hours by field. She showed the difference between crop water demand and actual rainfall. She showed that corn was still profitable in the right place, under the right conditions, with the right water. Then she showed the fields where corn had stopped being a crop and become a habit. Pause. The room got still, because farmers can ignore a speech. They cannot ignore a spreadsheet built from ground they recognize. Lena put up the 2012 comparison. Corn on better ground, 82 bushels, $96 net per acre. Sorghum on weak ground, 91 bushels, $204 net per acre. Then she put up the 2013 comparison, not as dramatic, more important because it proved the first year was not a fluke. She said, "I'm not here to tell you sorghum is magic. Magic is what we've been asking water to be." No one laughed. She said, "A farm that depends on one crop and one aquifer is not traditional, it is exposed." Pause. Then she said the line that people remembered. "The water is going to make a decision for us. The only choice we have is whether we make ours first." For 3 seconds after she finished, the room did nothing. Then Daniel stood. He did not clap above his head. He did not whistle. He did not make a scene. He just stood up, and that was enough. Chairs shifted. Hands came together. The room followed him. Lena looked at her father in the third row, and for the first time since she had come home, she understood that he had not given her 96 acres because he was unconvinced. He had given her 96 acres because some part of him already knew the farm needed an answer he did not yet have. Pause. The next spring, Boyd Harlan drove out to the Reyes place. It was a gray morning in March of 2015. The yard was soft from a small rain that would be gone by noon. Lena was in the shop changing seed plates when she heard tires on gravel. Boyd's white pickup stopped near the fuel tank. He stepped out slowly, hands in his coat pockets, looking older than he had looked behind his counter. Lena wiped grease off her fingers and walked out. He said 3 farmers had asked him that month about drought-tolerant sorghum. He said one of them wanted to know which varieties handled sandy soil. Another wanted to know about contracting. Another wanted to know whether the water savings were real. Then Boyd looked at her and said, "I don't have good answers." Pause. Lena let that sit. Then she asked, "Do you remember what you said in 2011? Boyd looked toward the fields. "I said a lot of things. You said I was going to learn the difference between a classroom and a county." He did not smile. She said, "I did." Pause. The county is slower to learn. It was not a cruel sentence. That was why it landed. Boyd nodded once, as if accepting the weight of something he was not ready to name. Lena opened the shop door. "I've got 3 years of notes. If you want answers, you can come see the numbers." He followed her inside. Teresa made coffee without asking. For 2 hours, Boyd Harlan sat at the Reyes kitchen table and listened to the young woman he had mocked explain water use efficiency, market basis, root depth, input costs, and which fields should never have been asked to behave like black Iowa soil. He asked better questions than Lena expected. She gave him better answers than he deserved. When he left, he shook her hand at the door. He did not apologize. Not then, but 3 weeks later, Harlan Seed and Supply ordered 4 drought-tolerant sorghum varieties. By April, extension bulletins on water, efficient rotations were sitting beside the corn catalogs at his counter. When farmers asked Boyd, who understood the local numbers, he told them, "Talk to Lena Reyes." He said it plainly, like a man reporting weather. Pause. And in a county built on reputation, that was its own kind of rain. By 2017, the Reyes farm had 840 acres in sorghum, 520 in wheat, and the rest split between corn on the best water ground and soil, building rotations that would have sounded ridiculous at the coffee counter 10 years earlier. Their total pumping hours were down. Their electricity bills were down. Their net return averaged across the farm was steadier, not because every year was better, but because fewer acres depended on the same fragile bet. Other farms began changing too. First 2, then 6, then 14. Not everyone, and not fast enough to save the aquifer. That part matters. No crop choice can undo decades of overdraft. The Ogallala did not rise because Lena kept better notebooks, but the decline slowed on wells that pumped less. Fields that used to demand rescue in August began surviving with restraint instead. The county did not become a new place overnight. It became a place with a second option. And sometimes that is how survival begins. Pause. In 2018, Lena presented at a regional water meeting in Garden City. Daniel drove her there. He sat in the front row this time, not the third. The room was larger than the county meeting. More officials, more researchers, more farmers from places that had different road names, but the same problem underneath them. Lena showed 5 years of Reyes farm records and 2 years of multi-farm trial data. She did not speak like a prodigy. She spoke like someone who had walked the rows, paid the bills, watched the leaves curl, and written down what happened after everyone else stopped watching. At the end, a farmer from Texas leaned toward Daniel and asked, "You know her?" Daniel kept looking at the stage. Then he said, "That's my daughter." He said it quietly, but his voice carried the pride of a man who had once worried what people would say, and now had the only answer that mattered. They said she was right. By 2020, Lena's son Mateo was 9 years old and had the dangerous habit of reading labels on seed bags before breakfast. One Saturday morning, he came into the kitchen with a library book about dryland peas and put it next to Lena's coffee. He opened to a page showing nitrogen fixation, root nodules, and water use. He said, "I think the East Field could do this after wheat." Lena looked at the book, then at her son, then at the page. She felt, all at once, the strange mercy of time folding back on itself. A kitchen table, a doubtful parent, a child with a page full of reasons. She asked him, "What do you think people will say?" Mateo shrugged. "They always say something." Then, "But the field will tell us." Lena leaned back in her chair. For a second, she saw her father sitting where Mateo sat now, looking at a notebook he did not want to believe. She saw Boyd Harlan laughing at a counter. She saw sorghum leaves curled against heat and opening again at dusk. She saw an electric meter spinning in the dark. Then she pushed the book back toward her son. "All right," she said. "Show me the numbers." That is where the story should end if you want it tidy. A daughter proves the county wrong. A critic changes his mind. A farm survives. But land does not care about tidy endings. The aquifer beneath Haskell County is still under pressure. The water is still going down. There are still fields planted from habit, bills paid from hope, and wells asked to do the work of rain. Lena Reyes did not solve the high plains. She did something smaller and harder. She stopped pretending that tradition was the same thing as truth. Her first notebook is still on the shelf in the farmhouse kitchen. The cover is bent. There is a coffee stain across the top corner from the night Daniel agreed to 96 acres. Inside are pump hours, bushels, prices, margins, heat notes, soil tests, and the patient evidence of a question most people were too proud to ask. What if what we have always done is not what the land can keep doing? Boyd Harlan retired in 2019. At a dinner in the VFW hall, he made a short speech about seed, weather, friendship, and all the farmers who had trusted him longer than he deserved. Near the end, he paused. Then he said there was one thing he had been late to understand. He said Lena Reyes had been right before the rest of them were ready to listen. He did not say he was sorry, but Lena, sitting near the back with her father and mother, heard what he was trying to give her. She nodded once, and Boyd looked relieved in a way that made him seem, for one moment, younger. The North Quarter is still in rotation. Some years it grows sorghum, some years wheat, some years a cover crop that makes no sense to anyone who only counts money at harvest. The pump on that field runs fewer hours now. The electric meter spins slower. The soil tests improve by small numbers that would bore anyone who does not understand compounding. But farmers understand compounding. One fraction at a time is how an aquifer disappears. One decision at a time is how a farm changes before it has no choice. Lena Reyes planted sorghum where everyone expected corn. They laughed because the old system still sounded confident. Then the drought came. The corn struggled. The sorghum held. And the notebook told a story louder than the men at the counter. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. The land does not care who sounds certain. The water does not care what your father planted. The future does not care what the county calls normal. It only asks one question, over and over, until someone is brave enough to write down the answer. What still works when the old way runs dry?